like, and subscribe.
Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 138 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, also known, of course, as the mighty OGGO, the only committee that matters. Before we start, as always, a nagging reminder to keep your headphones away from your microphones at all times so we can protect the hearing of our very valued interpreters. And we are back with Mr. Anderson. Welcome back to OGGO, Mr. Anderson. We'll start you off with a 5-minute opening, and we'll hopefully we'll get to you for the whole hour today. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to appear here. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Anderson. I'm a trade union researcher with PIPS, which is one of the major federal unions. But I'm here on my own behalf. I'm not here on behalf of PIPS at all. In a study I did some 10 years ago for the Canadian Postmasters and Assistants Association, I found Canada Post had shut down over 1,700 rural post offices since the 1980s. In spite of a 1994 moratorium on rural closures, the shutdowns continued. In a survey I did of 1,635 mayors, reeves, and band chiefs where a post office has been closed, documents that affect the communities, some communities saw their federally run post offices replaced with a franchise outlet. 53% of communities had no postal outlet of any kind. The closure of post offices were signaled out by many respondents as another nail in the coffin of rural Canada. At the time, some 24% of communities expressed very high levels of dissatisfaction with the present postal service. This survey, along with more than 10 years of work on postal issues, are contained in my recent December 2023 book, Why Canada Needs Postal Banking. This is the book here, which is published by Friesen Press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I welcome you, Mr. Anderson, to our meeting. I want to apologize for my voice. I woke up this morning and this is as good as it gets, so I will try and get through my questions. Move away, exactly. We too have noted the continuous closure of rural post offices despite the moratorium that you referenced in your opening remarks, which I think underpins, in my view, one of the compelling reasons for undertaking this study. I represent a very large rural riding in Saskatchewan, and this is an issue that I'm well aware of and have had many constituents raise concerns, as well as many community leaders who are deeply concerned about the loss of their post office. So I am intrigued, not that I haven't heard about postal banking and the potential of it before, but I am intrigued by your presentation. If Canada Post were to take on the responsibility of postal banking, would every post office that exists in rural Canada and maybe even in urban Canada, would every post office need the facilities to operate a bank and to operate as a bank? Is that one of your suggestions? And I guess knowing the infrastructure deficit we have in rural Canada when it comes to post offices and now even retail outlets, it would seem that for many communities, to construct the infrastructure needed to operate as a bank, such as vaults or teller desks, this might be untenable for them. Could you address that issue as well?
Well, I mean, I think that it's important to note that if you're going to offer postal banking services, it could be introduced, region by region, or it could be introduced all at once. Certainly, the idea of postal banking as it exists in, say, the United Kingdom or in France, which are two of the big examples, both of which are profitable for the postal services, offering these financial services. The French postal bank, the Banque Postal, is one of the top 50 largest banks in the world. And certainly, post offices right now already have computer hookup. just about very few. There may be one or two which don't, but the vast majority of them have access to internet access, etc. And this is really what is needed to offer banking services. That's the prime attribute, which obviously in the past, before that existed, it might have been more difficult. But now with that, it is not difficult. And they already in the past offered various services. I mean, you could buy financial services. You can still at a post office buy a postal money order, for example. And so they already have mechanisms to deal with money, with funds, etc., etc. And of course, they would have to be enhanced, those mechanisms. I don't think that is a particularly difficult thing to do. Plus, it's important to note that banking is a very prosperous industry. The big six banks in Canada last year made $60 billion in profit. So there's money in banking. There's money in offering services in banking, and that I think that postal banking would be able to offer services at reasonable rates. And it would be able to do this. So I think that this is something which can be delivered. Of course, there would have to be upgrading and training, but it's also possible nowadays to have online specialists to answer questions, etc.
Thank you very much. I do want, you didn't get to the end of your opening remarks. I did read them. And so I'm interested in hearing your opinion on the cancellation of the My Money Loan program that Canada Post had undertaken, and I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Well, I was very disappointed by the rapid cancellation of that program, which was only existed for a couple of months, really fully operational. Then it was canceled, and there was never a full explanation of why that was canceled. I don't know if you've had one here, but certainly that is something which was a step forward, and like I would welcome any steps forward for Canada Post to move in the direction of financial services. I think they're all very important ones, and they're all ones which are going to help rural post offices particularly. And I think it's really important to note that there's so many communities now which do not have a bank branch of any kind anymore. And I've interviewed mayors of communities who said, "Oh, we thought a plan to set ourselves up as a retirement community, and now that's in danger because we don't have any bank branches anymore." And many of the senior citizens, customers, which we want, residents, which we wanted to attract, don't want to come here because we don't have a bank branch. So I think that was a mistake, canceling that. I mean, if there was a problem, we should have been corrected. The Canada Post still says it's going to offer more financial services. That's still their plan. We haven't seen those financial services yet, but I hope that it moves forward in that direction. Of course, I think the main thing to do would be to offer postal banking services, and they'd be offered in a number of different ways. In the UK, postal banking services were introduced in a different way.
Sorry, we're past our time, but I'm sure in another round we can continue.
Mr. Anderson, I wanted to ask you, in the definition of rural in the 1994 moratorium, we actually don't have a definition of rural in that moratorium. And I wanted to ask you, to begin by asking you, in your opinion, how do we define rural when it comes to rural postal service? Let's start off with some basics.
Well, I don't have a clear example of that, but I think what is important in Canada is that it's important to always remember that Canada, along with Australia, I think are the two countries which have the highest percentage of their citizens living in major urban areas and not in small towns and not in rural communities. And so that we have a big tendency in Canada, because of that, to forget about what the needs of rural citizens are. As small town Canada, farm Canada, all of those things, all of those areas are often forgotten. And I think that that's why, postal banking, to me, is a crucial element, particularly in a time when the major banks and credit unions, and I worked for the Canadian Cooperative Association in the past, so I was close to credit unions, they have both shut down many branches, and this is not helpful. Those branches are shut down primarily, and the effect of shutting them down is primarily in small towns. And affect rural communities. That's where the effect of that is the most severe, and so therefore I think we've got to really reverse that. And the post office, because we have the locations, we have the staff. We have an opportunity to develop postal banking without the kind of massive investment. We have to find a bunch of locations. We've got locations. We've got staff. And we can move forward in that degree much faster than in a lot of other new government policies.
I'm just interested in the trend when it comes to the closure of rural and remote post offices. And what I've seen over the past couple of years in Northwest BC is this trend from full-service post offices with Canada Post staff to franchises to community mailboxes. And that is the way that Canada Post has essentially managed its budget or cut its budget on the backs of rural communities. Is that a fair assessment of sort of the trend that we're seeing? Because, Canada Post claims to be respecting this moratorium, and yet we see hundreds of rural post offices closing. How is that possible?
Well, I think you're bringing up an excellent point of the direction that Canada Post has been going in, and it has not been reinforcing its Canada Post-owned post offices. It has been. One of the greatest examples is right here in Ottawa, in the Glebe neighborhood, where you have a major post office, and then right across the street, literally across the street, you have a post office in a pharmacy, and yet the pharmacy hours for the post office are very substantial. The post office hours for the Canada Post-owned post office are very small. The hours they're not extensive. You can't get service in the evenings, this kind of thing. So we have to, I think, go back on those issues, and we have to look at those issues of providing more and better services and assuring that we don't close down post offices and we don't reduce the services that they're offering. And what I'm proposing is that we offer more services in the post office in all kinds of outlets, whether they're owned by Canada Post or directly or not. But obviously the Canada Post-owned directly ones are important because usually they're substantial buildings, standalone buildings can easily have the place to increase the infrastructure and to offer banking services.
Canada Post has a revenue neutral mandate, so they essentially are given the mandate by the government to cover their costs through their operations. And I think it's fair to say that in remote communities and very small rural communities, it's very difficult to imagine how the service could possibly pay for itself just on the basis of population and the volume of parcels. There are some fixed costs in operating a post office that probably can't be justified based on the volume. Is one of the solutions to think about rural and remote communities differently from the rest of Canada Post service and have a different mandate for rural delivery in Canada, where we think about it more as an essential service and less as something that has to recover 100% of its costs?
Well, I think that Canada Post has to look at itself as one entity, and it has to pay particular attention to rural and remote post office locations. Certainly, that's why I think why I'm proposing postal banking, because postal banking is a very profitable business, and for example, in 2023, the Banque Postal in France made $1.4 billion in profit in Canadian dollars. So I think that this would help. Offering postal bank service would help to have the money to fund services right across the board in communities where just delivering the services might not pay for all the operations. So we have to look at the whole structure and see how we can look at new revenue earning systems and functions which can help us deliver good quality postal services both in large cities and in small towns and rural areas.
Is that the only hope for a rural postal service? That Canada Post has to find ways to generate more revenue? I'm thinking about rural transportation is the other analogous service where, the government keeps trying to find the private sector partners that are somehow going to deliver money-losing services to sparsely populated regions instead of thinking about rural transportation as an essential service that's required in order for rural Canada to be part of the fabric of our country. Is something like postal banking the only hope for rural postal service?
In 30 seconds, Mr. Anderson.
It's not the only hope. It's an important hope. Certainly, the government has to guarantee postal services to everybody. That has to be a guarantee, whether Canada Post makes a profit or not.
Thanks, Mr. Bachrach. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. We're now going to our 5-minute rounds. Mrs. Kusi, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Anderson, for being here with us today. My questions today will be around the security of postal banking. Canada has some of the strongest regulations when it comes to ensuring its banking system remains secure. In your opinion, how could Canada's post offices be able to meet those regulations and ensure the continued safety of Canada's financial institutions, please?
Well, I would give you the example of the United Kingdom, where it's only been a very short time, less than a couple of decades before, where postal banking services have been introduced in the United Kingdom and through all their post offices. And so I think they've managed to do that. And as I said in the brief, when I was talking to the head of one of the heads of the money services for the post office, he said, I'd be very happy to come over here and show you how to do it. That's what he told me in an interview I did with him. Now, I don't think we need to ask somebody from the United Kingdom to come over and show us how to do that in the post office. But we can look at how they've done it. And certainly what is also important to note is that the federal government has a number of banking services. The federal government has many banking institutions already, has the BDC, the EDC, Farm Credit Canada, etc. It has many banking services and many highly trained and specialized people in banking services, in security services, etc., etc. So it's not that we can't find them. They're employed by the federal government through these institutions, and certainly we can. In setting up those services, the postal bank could use some of that expertise to assure that we have a secure banking system.
So, in your opinion, currently, do post offices have the supplies, expertise, and security to properly complete transactions and secure the money of Canadians?
I think that they're already doing that. As far as I said, it depends on obviously the postal office location, but they do postal money orders and secure cash and in that situation already. They're doing that, and so for us to move to a more advanced system around offering more services, I think is possible. I mean, we were going to do that with the loans-based program, which was canceled. So obviously, they had thought about how they were going to deliver that, and they've still not explained why that program was canceled. But I think it's possible to introduce those programs in a secure fashion. I believe we have the expertise, and we're going to have to train people and upgrade people's training, but we already have employees who we can do that with and introduce these services gradually so that we are able to handle those services. As I said, it's been done in other countries. It isn't, the only places. New Zealand is another country where they recently introduced a postal banking system. In many countries, they've had them for a longer period of time, but I believe we can do that, and it's not something different. As I said, the federal government has huge financial services and has expertise in financial services, and certainly those services can be used to help structure postal banking services as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, you mentioned these services. So, for example, Canada Post is currently partnered with TD Bank, but going back to the security aspect, TD Bank in the United States obtained a $9 million fine for fraudulent transactions with the potential of $4 billion being involved in these fraudulent transactions. And you point to bringing in the United Kingdom, but as I understand it, the United Kingdom is currently 90% privatized. And if we look at France, both Royal Mail and La Poste are privatized. So in building on this idea, incorporating other countries where the banking is largely privatized, and considering the current security threats that exist, as indicated in the TD example that I gave, would you expect Canada Post to create more partnerships with Canada's banks or work independently?
Well, my personal...
Mr. Anderson, I apologize, but there was not enough time left for a response, so perhaps you can get to it.
Up until 1968, that Canada and U.S. had postal banking services. Can you speak a bit about what that looked like in operation, and perhaps your opinion on why we moved away from it in 1968?
Well, I mean, I think that's a PhD thesis there, a doctoral thesis for somebody, as to why Canada and the U.S. Dissolved their postal banking services in the same year. Obviously, there were a lot of institutions which, private sector financial institutions which were not happy with the postal banking being delivered at all, and so that it was ended fairly abruptly, and I don't think that was a good measure, but it was done at that time. It's interesting to know that in the United States as well, it's not just in Canada where there's been a revival of postal banking issues, and that I in fact went to the United States and heard Senator Elizabeth Warren. I know Senator Bernie Sanders are both two advocates, as many others, around postal banking issues in the United States. So there's a move to reconstitute that for the exact same reasons in terms that we're talking about here: closure of rural and banking branches, the fact that you can't get banking services in large parts of the United States in the same way as you used to.
Thank you. And you mentioned, your preference for the Banque Postal model versus the UK post office. There's also other examples. There's Japan, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Brazil. Many have been privatized or shut down. Can you explain the mixed success of postal banking internationally and why the introduction of postal banking has often led to privatization?
Well, I think that postal banking is still extremely growing phenomenon worldwide. The latest report shows that. So it's not something which is shrinking, it's growing worldwide in terms of number of banking accounts, etc. How a postal bank is managed and whether it is managed in terms of a partnership with the private sector or it is a state-owned institution depends a lot on the politics of the day in that particular country and how that people see those developments. But as I said, I mean, we've seen very successful postal banking, and I point to the French model simply because obviously Canada has a particular affinity with France, and looking at what's happening in France for good reasons, and that is one where it's been very successful. But even in the UK, where it's not as extensive a model, and it's done in where they've had private sector banks run the services for the post office, it's still a situation where you can go into any post office in the UK and deposit money, withdraw money, open savings accounts, all kinds of things like that, which is extremely important, which you cannot do in Canada. And so I think we can do it in a number of different ways. Which is the best way to do it? As I said, I have my preference, but I think that any step forward in terms of postal banking is important. And I think it's important mainly for small town and rural Canada, but also even in big cities where we've got banking deserts. You've got to go to the downtown of any, or the central area of many Canadian cities, and you will find very few banking branches anymore.
Right now, what we're seeing is that the postmasters in these circumstances are very poorly compensated. When one of them passes away or for some reason leaves the position, Canada Post has a very difficult time recruiting new rural postmasters to fill those spots. Thinking about postal banking, is that also not a rationale to return to the retail outlet model whereby Canada Post operates a post office that's owned by Canada Post with Canada Post unionized staff that provide services other than postal services, including postal banking and electric vehicle charging, that kind of thing? Do we need to look more at that model for small communities?
Well, definitely, I think we have to look at delivering equal services. And if the model which we have in terms of how the postal outlets are run is putting in danger those services, we have to move to try to correct that. I think that's obviously the case. People have to be able to get the same kinds of equal services, and we have to make sure that postmasters who are running these services are treated equally. We've already seen the terrible crisis that occurred in the UK around this, in terms of how some people were treated around the crisis which they had there around that issue. But I think that we can do this and make sure that we are funding adequately the delivery of rural services. And as I said, postal banking can help that because it can bring in additional revenue, which will allow the post office to have the ability to make sure that rural services are delivered in an equal fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Brock, and then we'll finish with Mr. Baines.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Anderson, for your attendance and your contribution to this study. I've got essentially a couple of questions. I may not use all my 5 minutes, but I'm going to read all the questions out to you and give you as much time for your response. So I'm curious as to how the post office itself would compete with large Canadian banks across the country that already have the infrastructure, they already have the name recognition, and are well established. That's one question. Would the new postal banking service rely on public funding? If the post office were offering loans while it is losing $750 million a year, what funds would they be relying on to fund those loans? And lastly, how much would it cost to set up the infrastructure required for postal banking?
Well, thank you very much. Excellent questions. Certainly, postal banking around the world has been a situation where the postal banks have competed with traditional private sector banks, and in the case of Canada, it's not just the private sector; it's credit unions, which are, if you take Quebec, I think it's 70% or more of citizens in Quebec use credit unions as their primary banking source. So there would be competition with existing models. But however, I think that is that competition is justified because banks and credit unions, but particularly banks, have reneged on what the services that they are providing, particularly to rural Canada. They've pulled out. You can just Google any of the big banks and bank branch closures, and you'll see what towns are hit by the closure of banks, banking branches in small town Canada, a huge number on a regular basis. And so I think that there's first of all, we need to challenge. Excuse me. We need to challenge that, and I think postal banking is one of the ways of offering those kind of services. In the UK, of course, what the system there is that you can use your banking card with another with a bank. With another bank to take out money at the post office. So there's ways of accommodating if you're a member of another bank. But I think that it does offer a service which is, extremely important, and I think we could deliver things. The cost of that, I think, temporarily, in order to get the system running, we would have to borrow a small amount of money, but not huge amounts, because we already have an infrastructure. We don't have to buy buildings. We don't have to hire staff. We've got to train staff and introduce programs slowly as we, in terms of services, to make sure the services are accurate and are working well for Canadians who would use them. But I think that is something which is going to be repaid. We've seen in general, in terms of postal banking around the world, that it has been a profitable service. As I said, because many people don't have any other access to banking services, so they would use those postal banking services because they don't have the access to them. And as I said, I mean, right now we've seen another, the form that the Canada Post was going to start off was a partnership with TD. They were going to work with TD to deliver some of the financial services through the post office. So there are different ways of doing it. And I think that we can build that situation up where we are able to offer postal banking services in a profitable manner, and I think it's something which does not demand vast amounts of government money in terms of investment to do those things. And we're in a new age, of course, in terms of the internet age, where a lot of these services can be delivered by trained personnel over the internet, and so it's not something where we have to. Well, how are we going to deliver that services? No, we can teach somebody how to deliver a banking service over the internet, and they can have contact with somebody in a central office, etc. And we should be using at the federal level our trained banking experts who are in EDC, the BDC, the Farm Credit Canada, etc., where we have this whole banking infrastructure in Canada, which is very large at the federal level, owned by the federal government. So it's not that we don't have anybody who knows what they're doing around banking services. We do.
Thank you. Mr. Baines, go ahead, please.
Can you maybe shed light on some of the maybe research you've done and explain like the mixed success of postal banking internationally? What models have been very successful, and where have they maybe been introduced and then led to privatization?
Well, as I said, most European countries have, if you want to start there, have successful postal banking institutions. Some fairly recently, others for a longer time. Some do not, but the majority do. And of course, we've got major countries such as Japan, China as well, which have big postal banking institutions. In Japan, is one of the largest banks is Postal Bank. Certainly, those companies have been developed using postal staff, retraining them, adding new people where necessary, and I think that it is something which the track record in general is very good. As I mentioned, if some of the banks, the Japan Postal Bank, the French Postal Bank, and the Chinese one are amongst the largest banks in the world.
Anderson, can I get you to just wrap up? We're past our time.
Okay. So I think that's something which we do have the capacities to do that, and we can find the people who and the programs which will make that secure around those issues.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Baines. Mr. Anderson, thank you for taking the time coming back for a second appearance at OGGO. We appreciate everything.